Hello everyone, welcome back to another lecture. Today we're going to be taking a look at our first in a pair of pieces examining the desirability of immortality. So we've already looked at some pieces talking about the afterlife and death, but if you recall in those pieces, those terms were defined in such a way that we weren't really talking about a personal immortality, that is living forever as a single individual, or even with others, but your own existence carrying on. But rather, when we're taking a look at the afterlife before, we were thinking about that in terms of really people living after we're gone, so the continued existence of the human species, and presumably people we care about, or at least people we could potentially care about. And when we're looking at death, the way Nagel defined that was really as a permanent end to one's existence. So not death as some kind of transition to some other form of life, but rather as just a terminus, as the very end of one's own existence. So what we're going to start taking a look at here today, and we'll carry on with tomorrow in the lecture on Fisher, is really the question of personal immortality. And really, it's not going to be a question of whether or not we have good reason to believe that we are personally immortal. That's just something we're not really going to deal with in this course. Rather, it's going to be a question about whether or not personal immortality is something that is actually desirable. And if it is desirable, what, if anything, it would seem to add to a meaningful human life. So the piece we're going to take a look at today is by Bernard Williams, 20th century British philosopher, well known for a number of books and various essays. Williams himself considers a lot in this piece. I'm really not going to be able to even just sort of touch on and explain a number of interesting things he says, and movements and thinkers he even mentions in here. What I'm going to do instead is try to draw attention to and clearly explain really the core parts of the argument concerning immortality that Williams puts together. So this piece we've got here, the Makropulos Case, Reflections on the Tedium of Immortality, this comes from a book called The Problems of the Self that he published in 1973. And so in the piece, what are we going to see Williams do? Well, he introduces us to this Makropulos case, just what it is. Considers some views on death, about whether or not death is a good thing or a bad thing. And in fact, in here, he talks at least a little bit about Nagel's piece. He distinguishes conditional desires from categorical desires. So this is an important distinction he makes between two different kinds of desires he thinks we can separate out, right, sort of tease apart, say, okay, we've got these desires and those desires, and they have a different kind of relationship to our reasons for living, which might also factor into reasons we might not want to live. Then he introduces two conditions an immortal life has to meet for it to be appealing and meaningful, and he ultimately concludes that no human life can actually meet those two conditions. And so he concludes, he relays a joint conclusion that it can never be desirable or meaningful to live forever. So in fact, personal immortality is antithetical to a meaningful life. And this is very much contrary to Quinn, Tolstoy, Craig. We might think of some other people who want to stick in here. But he thinks immortality is actually antithetical to a meaningful life. That is, you can't really have a meaningful life if you live forever. And even though that's the case, death can still be an evil. Death can still be something worth avoiding, at least for some time. Right? One other conclusion that we can say he draws from his reflections here is that for life to have meaning, it has to be a life that ends. That is, death is in some sense what gives life its meaning. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. So first, we get this Makropulos case. So he introduces this character, Alina Macropolis, who goes by a number of other names as well. Ultimately, EM are her initials, and all her various identities and so on have these initials EM. She's a fictional character. This comes from a play, so it's not like Williams is trying to report some fact here. But the interesting part about EM, I'm just going to refer to her as EM, but really it's Macropolis, is that she takes an elixir at the age of 42. So, and this is supposed to be back in, I think he said it's the 16th century. So her father is some kind of doctor or researcher or magician, whatever. Right? But he develops this elixir of immortality. He gives it to EM, and she takes it. And so she stays at, like, biologically at age 42 for 300 years. And the play that this comes from, it was a story and it's turned into a play, occurs 300 years later, so she's really aged 342, but in body and in effect in mind, in her mental capacity, she's still 42. Of course, she has those 300 years of extra experiences, but really she herself hasn't changed. Her body hasn't aged in any discernible format. Her mental powers haven't declined in any noticeable way or anything like that. So at the age of 342, right, and for all intents and purposes, she's still aged 42. If you ran into her, you'd think, oh, here's a 42-year-old woman. At this point, she is just completely bored with life, just exhausted by it. It's just not interesting to her anymore. So she has no reason to live. Now, the way the elixir works is that she has to keep retaking it to stay alive. And so eventually she just decides at age 342, she just doesn't want to take it again. She dies. Right? And so what Williams really wants to do in this piece is, as he puts it, pursue the idea that from facts about human desire and happiness and what a human life is, it follows both that immortality would be, were conceivable at all, intolerable, and that, other things being equal, death is reasonably regarded as an evil. So EM's case, Williams thinks, shows us that death isn't necessarily an evil, precisely because in her case, it appears that death is at some point welcome. She lives long enough that life just doesn't seem worth living anymore, so she wants to die, right? And if you want to die and then you do die, it's not really clear how dying can be regarded as something that really isn't evil, because at least one way to look at what it is for something to be evil is that it runs contrary to what we desire, right? It's not the thing we want. It doesn't satisfy our preferences. So Williams wants to take a look at this, right? So after talking about Macropolis a little bit, talking about EM, thinking about this and saying, okay, so it seems like immortality is really intolerable, right? That's EM's case seems to show us this. And it also seems to show us that death can at least be regarded as an evil, all other things considered, right? Can be, isn't necessarily though. So as he mentions, death is said by some not to be an evil because it is not the end, and by others because it is. And here he discusses some different religions and philosophies that look at death, and he says there's two different ways to look at it. Looking at death not really being evil. One way to look at it is that death isn't an evil precisely because it's not the end of us. It's really this kind of transition to something else. We die here, but that's really just our earthly body dying, and then either, depending on the details of the particular theism in question, a disembodied part of us continues to live on, a soul or a spirit or a consciousness, or there's going to be some kind of bodily resurrection where you get your physical body back, and then will continue your life at some later point. Right? And of course, you can have variations of this as well, where perhaps your soul or consciousness continues existing without a body, and then at some future time, there will be another body created for it, the soul or consciousness will somehow be reunited with it. So one way to look at death not being an evil is precisely by rejecting the fact that it's really the end of your existence. On the other hand, there are views that look at death and say it's not really an evil precisely because it is the end. This is what Nagel was thinking about. This is where Williams also talks about Lucretius, an ancient Roman Epicurean philosopher. And really the view there is for something to be an evil, it has to be something bad in your experience, right? Something that you don't want, or it's painful, or something like this, right? But by being dead, you no longer exist, which means you can't have any more experiences, which means nothing bad can happen to you because you're not there to experience bad things. So there are these two different ways of looking at death and looking at it very differently, right? Saying it's not the end of us or it is the end of us. But no matter which way you go on that, still coming to the same conclusion that death isn't really a bad thing after all. So Williams talks about that and thinks about that a little bit. But one other view he wants to take a look at is that death can in fact be an evil because it frustrates the satisfaction of our desires. And Nagel approached it in this kind of fashion as well. There's a little bit of a difference there. Williams and Nagel agree and disagree in some ways, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Williams remarks that he's not really interested in cases of extreme suffering, so he's not looking at cases where people, by staying alive, are really doomed to be stuck suffering and in pain all the time, and so want to die because of that. So he just wants to set that aside. Rather, he wants to look at just other sorts of cases. You know, what, assuming we weren't going to be in perpetual pain or something like that, would death be a bad thing or not? Well, minimally, it seems like it could be a problem or a bad thing precisely because it doesn't allow us to satisfy some of our desires. It doesn't let us engage in the projects we want to engage with, accomplish the things we want to accomplish, and so on. Okay, so that's right. That's some reason to think maybe death really can be. And here again, no, part of what's going on in Williams here, which was also going on in Nagel, which is also going on in Nozick, and it's something that just goes on in philosophy quite generally, is that I'm going to use this we, philosophers in general, while we're interested in trying to figure out what's true or what the real best reasons support, we're not always just engaged in just sort of coming out and just saying, oh, believe this, and here, this is true, and here's what I believe. And right? We explore, right? We want to look around and think about things and take some time and really say, oh, well, look, you know, there's reasons to think this way, there's reasons to think that way. How should we weigh those reasons? How do they intersect with each other? What other sorts of reasons engage with those reasons? How else might we get to the same conclusion? Or how might the same reason take us to different conclusions, right? So part of what Williams is doing here is exploring, right? He's not just coming out and saying, okay, I believe these 6 things, I want you to believe them too. That can be nice and clear. In fact, right, often what I'm hoping to get you to do in your own writing is to try to be nice and clear, because I think that's a valuable skill to have. But in going through the reading, you have to be sensitive to the fact that just because they say something or raise an argument doesn't mean they necessarily endorse it. Okay, so moving ahead here, so we've got this exploration of whether or not death is necessarily an evil, right? Has to be an evil, or can it maybe not be an evil? Can it be not so bad? We've got some reasons to think maybe death isn't so bad. We also have at least one reason here to think that death can be an evil, at least right, can be. All right, so moving on to this distinction Williams draws between 2 different kinds of desires, conditional desires and categorical desires. Now, a conditional desire is a kind of desire that we have on the condition that we're alive. Right? Think, for instance, wanting to eat, right, or drink. In fact, I'm a little thirsty, take a little drink of water. Now, the fact that I desire to have a drink of water is really conditional on the fact that I'm alive, the kind of creature that requires water to stay alive, right? I get thirsty. But if I were confronted with the prospect of immortality, and somebody said, what reason do you have to live forever? I certainly wouldn't say, so that I can be around to take a drink when I'm thirsty. Because of course, if I'm dead, I'm never going to be thirsty again. So my having the desire to take a drink of water is conditional on the fact that I'm alive, and it's only by being alive that I become thirsty, and it's only because I'm thirsty that I want to have a drink of water. That's good. Occasionally I might give you very small bits of life advice. I don't think I'm very qualified to give you very much. Drink water. It's a good thing. Okay, so the other kind of desires are categorical desires. Now, categorical desires are desires that really give us a reason to live, right? Rather than only having those desires on the condition or because we're alive, Rather, categorical desires are the sorts of desires that really give us a reason to want to be alive, right? And they're the sorts of desires that we want satisfied, irrespective of our own staying alive. So these are, desires, just to give some examples, wanting to see one's offspring flourish, right? Wanting one's children to live well and be healthy and so on. Wanting some cause that one considers larger than themselves to come to fruition, say fighting in a war where you think your side really needs to win, and so you're willing to sacrifice your life for that. Say trying to cure a disease, right? You're trying to cure cancer. Now, it's not just because you think it's fun or someone gives you a project, but rather you think curing cancer is something really, really important, right? And that itself can give you a reason to live, pursuing that. And in fact, it could be something that you want to see, or something you want to happen, even if it's after your own death. So you're not around to experience the pleasure and satisfaction of seeing it actually come to fruition. Just a note on the language. So we've got these two different kinds of desires. The conditional one, I think, is pretty clear, right? It's a desire on the condition that you're alive. Categorical desire, what does it mean to be categorical? Really exceptionless, right? So the conditional desire has a kind of exception, right? You don't have that desire if you're dead. But a categorical desire is the kind of desire that you have that really cuts across those sorts of exceptions, right? Whether or not I'm alive or dead, I want cancer to be cured. I want my offspring to do well. I want the earth to be a place inhabitable and desirable to be on for humans and for future generations. Something like that. So this is the distinctions William draws here. And he thinks this is going to be pretty important in terms of our thinking for immortality and whether or not an immortal life would really be desirable. All right. Now, Williams thinks that really it's our fulfilling our categorical desires that gives us some kind of reason to live. And it's really having some kind of reason to live that makes for a meaningful life. Now, death is in fact typically an evil precisely because it interferes with our ability to fulfill our categorical desires, right? Death is a thing that really gets in the way of being able to work towards fulfilling these things. Now, Williams himself claims that, in his words, the reasons which a man would have for avoiding death are grounded in desires, categorical desires, which he has. So on Williams' view, the reason we have to avoid death is really in our desires, right? So it's still something in our desires and our own sort of mental states and attitudes that makes our death something potentially bad or good. Now, Williams talks about Nagel's view some, so just to bring that back up here. Won't go into it in too much detail. It's something interesting you might want to engage with it in a forum post or critical response maybe, but we're not, Williams or Nagel has the better view here. You don't have to, it's just an idea. Williams and Nagel agree in some sense that death can be an evil, doesn't necessarily have to be an evil, but they differ in the way they come about it. So Nagel's view really rests on objective values, things that can be independent of the desires of an individual. But Williams' view, as he puts it, is closer to utilitarianism, a very popular ethical theory of the 19th, 20th centuries, ultimately locates good in pleasure and bad in pain, but looks at it from an overall perspective. So really, for the utilitarian, what's good? Maximizing aggregate utility, as they put it, or overall happiness. Right? Trying to make overall happiness increase. That's really what makes for good actions. Things that make overall happiness decrease, those are bad. So utilitarianism is really a version of hedonism, which I was talking about hedonism last time I was talking about Nagel. Hedonism is really this view that really what's good and what's bad or evil really comes down to questions of pleasure and pain. Right? Desirable experiences or undesirable experiences. So Williams says that his own view is a little closer to utilitarianism and hedonism than Nagel's, because ultimately Williams wants to ground his views on death and whether or not an immortal life is meaningful on our desires. Right? Nagel is willing to step outside of our desires and say that there can be things that are good and bad or good and evil that actually go beyond the desires or experiences of any particular people. And this is really what Nagel was getting at when he said, some goods can be relational, or some goods or evils can be the sort of thing that we can't spatio-temporally assign to some particular agent. It's not that on Tuesday at 3 p.m., I found out some terrible fact and that's what makes it bad, right? Things can be good or bad independent of our finding out about them, our experiencing them, our having a particular attitude toward them, and so on. Okay, so now, given William's view here, right, that fulfilling our categorical desires really gives us a reason to live, that dying can get in the way of doing this sort of thing, it at least seems like staying alive might always be better than dying, right? And this is really the point Nagel left off with, too, right? Nagel engages in these think about death and ultimately concludes, he says, well, we can at least see death as a potential evil insofar as it cuts off certain possibilities from people, right? That if they had stayed alive, they could have worked on their categorical desires more, or so on. But of course, Nagel says, well, he sort of leaves it a little open-ended, right? Really, Nagel leaves off on this question, is it always a bad thing to die, or can it actually be a good thing to die, at least sometimes? This is really where Williams is at this point, right? It almost seems like staying alive forever is really the preferable option over dying at some point, because it's only by living forever that we can continually try to fulfill our categorical desires. So this is where Williams really wants to take us now. Now, Williams rejects the suggestion that staying alive is always better than death. Nagel's just really non-committal. At the end of Nagel's piece, we don't get an answer. Right? But Williams, ultimately, his conclusion is that immortality, staying alive, at least as a human the way we know it, is ultimately something not desirable. Why is this? Well, there is the issue of deteriorating quality of life as we age. Right, our bodies decline, right? They sort of lose vitality, lose energy, and so on, become more susceptible to disease and pain and so on. There's also the question of deteriorating mental capacity, right? Issues concerning dementia and cognitive decline and so on. But Williams wants to actually just bracket those issues, right? He says, okay, we could look at those as parts of our experiences that would make our lives ultimately not worth living, perhaps, depending on the kind of condition our bodies or minds were in. But he says, okay, if we take a look at the EM case, though, and we say, what if somebody were in the prime of their life, right? Say they were 42, and which there's sort of a couple of funny things about the number. I realize this is an aside. I'll come back to the point. From my understanding, when Williams first gave the remarks that make up this piece, he himself was 42, so he thought, being alive at the age of 42 would be quite fine, quite welcome. Also, you've probably noticed on the Turnitin account, the password for our site was 42, though that comes from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Feel free to look it up if that doesn't immediately ring any bells. Okay, so coming back to the point I was originally making here. So Williams thinks, given the EM case, we can bracket these questions of deteriorating, bodily and mental integrity, and instead just look at this question of, would it be worth living or would it be desirable to keep on living if we could avoid those sorts of issues, right? Winding up in sort of chronic pain and suffering, losing your mental capacity, losing your bodily capacity to do different sorts of things. Imagine we could keep all that, right? So imagine you could just sort of freeze frame yourself at, right, whatever age you want to pick, 20, 25, 30, 15, 60, whatever it might be. What if you could just keep your body and your mind sort of in that state? This isn't sort of cutting off any ability to grow, make yourself more fit or learn more things or something like that, but rather just these questions of underlying capacities. Right? Now, Williams thinks that even by bracketing some of those issues, like the way the EM case lets us do, her case still shows us that ultimately our quality of life will deteriorate over time, not because of changes to our body or mind, like our mental or physical capacities, but because of the repetitive nature of our experiences, because our relationship to the world around us would change. Right? Now, Williams claims that an endless life would be a meaningless one, and that we could have no reason for living eternally a human life. He continues on, he says, there's no desirable or significant property which life would have more of, or have more unqualifiedly, if we lasted forever. So, although it might seem like it would be a good thing to live forever because we could always be working on fulfilling our categorical desires, in fact, Williams thinks that's not the case. Right? And he thinks ultimately the lesson he wants to draw from the EM case, which he thinks is appropriate, is that eventually we would really cease to have categorical desires which would give us a reason to live. Okay, so Williams gives us two conditions that he thinks an immortal human life has to meet to be appealing. And just one thing I want to remark here, he is talking about an immortal human life in part, and he does consider, and we'll come around to this in a moment, he considers a few different models of immortality, but ultimately he's interested in immortality that really, well, has to meet this first condition, which is really an identity condition. It should clearly be me who lives forever. That is, it has to be a kind of immortality in which who we are now, as the humans we are the things that go on living forever. So some other kind of immortality that really isn't us carrying on, but is some other sort of thing, doesn't really meet the conditions Williams wants. So Williams says, first, it has to really, for immortality to be desirable for Williams, and he thinks really for everybody, it has to be, him who lives forever. It has to be ourselves. And secondly, the state in which I survive, this is Williams, should be one which, to me looking forward, will be adequately related in a life it presents to those aims which I now have in wanting to survive at all. What does this mean in effect? Well, it means that Williams' categorical desires have to remain essentially the same over time. That if he's looking ahead 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 50,000, 50 million, right, years, don't forget, we're talking about immortality. We're talking about living forever. Right? Williams says, right, as I look forward, no matter how far in time, it really has to be me who's still there. Otherwise, it's not an immortal life. It's not my life that's continuing on at some other life that started at some point. And the life that's going on has to be the kind of life that is connected to the reasons I now have to live, that those carry on into the future. Right? Otherwise, at some point, it's not really going to be desirable to live forever to me now, because if my desires change significantly enough in the future, that might not be the sort of thing that I now can actually desire. So I think rather than saying more about these two conditions right now, I'm just going to take a look at the different forms of immortality Williams himself looks at, because I think they're a good way of trying to talk about these two conditions and make sense of them. So these four kinds of immortality Williams considers. And one thing I will note, I think in the reading, he could have done a better job of flagging these by just sort of saying, okay, first kind, second kind, third. I think that probably would have been helpful, but this is ultimately what he's doing. He's considering sort of moving down a list and sort of saying, okay, well, what are the different sorts of models of immortality, and can they meet these conditions or not? So the first kind of immortal life would be a continuous life, right? Such as EMs. And this is a pretty easy one to think about. Just think about your current life, but it just goes on forever, right? It never ends. It's just perpetually moving into the future in exactly the same way it does right now, day to day, year to year, and so on. Now, this kind of immortal life Williams thinks, ultimately results in an exhaustion of our categorical desires, right? And ultimately leads to boredom. And that boredom really comes from not having categorical desires anymore. Right? When we live our lives, so to speak, we pursue our projects, there are things that we're trying to do, we have reasons we can point to for living. But Williams thinks eventually we would come to really exhaust these things. We'd become bored with them, right? Why, no matter how engrossing we find something to be, ultimately we will come to find it boring and not worth doing eventually, Williams thinks. So ultimately, a continuous life would meet the first condition, right, the identity condition. It would still be the same person living through time. But eventually we would just run out of categorical desires, and so that immortal life wouldn't really be desirable to us based on what we now consider to be our reasons to live. And now, of course, there's a possibility, and Williams considers this but rejects it, and we'll come back to it a little bit at the end. What if our categorical desires change over time? And he wants to reject that view because he says, well, if we have entirely different categorical desires at some point in the future, then in some sense that future life becomes disconnected from our present life, either in terms of the identity condition, right? Who we are is in part defined by what things we think are worth doing, or the desirability condition, right? If right now I think my reasons to live include, right, let's just say doing philosophy and charitable work, right? And 1,000 years in the future, if I get to live forever, 1,000 years in the future, I'm going to think philosophy is stupid and I don't care about helping people anymore. Instead, my categorical desires are producing paintings of, I don't know, snails and actually taking candy from children and just kind of being a jerk. Those are the things that just make my life worth living at that point. Well, the fact that now those aren't my categorical desires means that right now, that future life where those are my reasons to live, at present, I'm not going to think that's a life worth living. So my future life no longer is desirable by me here and now. Right? And given that Williams wants to ground whether or not lives are worth living or whether or not death is an evil in our desires and our pursuit of those desires in some sense, even if it stretches beyond our present life, he thinks that anything that's any kind of view that's trying to step outside our desires in judging whether or not immortal life is worth living is going to be a kind of mistaken view. All right, so the continuous life meets the identity condition, but not the desirability condition, right? Meets condition 1, but not condition 2. And so Williams thinks really isn't going to be a desirable form of immortality. The second form of immortality he thinks about is a set of serial lives. It's really a series of disconnected lives. And he says, that we could think about those in some different ways. Maybe you now know what you're going to do in the future, but ultimately you can't know what went on in the past. So you're not going to be able to have memory of those previous lives you had. So this kind of immortality might meet that second condition, the desirability condition, because in each life you might have different categorical desires or different reasons to live. But because in each of those lives, you can have different desires, right? And ultimately, you don't have continuous memory through them. You don't realize that you were this person and then this person and this person. It's going to fail the identity condition. And you can here think about forms of reincarnation, right? So, and I'm just going to talk about this in a very general way. Of course, you could pick particular religions or philosophies that have a particular version of reincarnation in them. Let's set aside all the particular details, but just in very broad strokes, outline some version of reincarnation where your soul or spirit or whatever we want to call it carries on and lives through different bodily manifestations, right? So who I am now, in the past I was something else, whether it was another human, right? Say I've had several human lives before, or perhaps animal lives, or whatever it might be, right? Who I really am is some kind of spirit or something that now animates me. But of course, when we think in conscious terms, I don't have any memory of previous lives, right? Of living as a different person or a different animal or something like that. So in effect, calling, right, who I really am that spirit seems to disregard my consciousness. Um, Williams doesn't quite say this, but we might as well say that you're me and I'm you, right? For all intents and purposes, I don't have your conscious experience, I don't have your memories and so on. I don't have the conscious experience or memories of people who have lived in the past. So even if there is some kind of connection, right, spiritual or perhaps material, that's a pretty easy way to think of it too, right? The particles we're now made up of used to be particles of other things, presumably other living things at one point. But that doesn't mean, just because I've got some particles that used to be in dinosaurs or plants or insects or whatever, doesn't mean I'm now a dinosaur or a plant or an insect. So this version of immortality, Williams really doesn't think is going to work either. Just going back to the first kind, the continuous life, we can think there as well. Williams is really primarily interested in exploring an eternal human life, right? Just what if we kept living, right, immortally now as we are. But we can also insert versions of heaven and an afterlife in that theistic sense of life that carries on after a bodily death, presumably on some other plane of existence or something like that. Right? That would be another version of continuous life. Right? So way to form the question in terms of the continuous life. Can't you get bored in heaven? All right, third, disjointed lives. This is the third and fourth cases are, in some sense, trickier than the first two. So the first two, I think, are pretty easy to think about, right? The continuous life is really just your present life is carrying on into the future indefinitely. You can think about that in terms of, going to heaven or something, or just staying around on Earth, right, with no expiry date, so to speak. You just go on living. Williams thinks that's not desirable. Right? We're going to exhaust our categorical desires. Eventually, you're going to get bored, right? Whether it's here on Earth or up in heaven, eventually you're just going to be sick of it. Second, the serialized as some version of reincarnation, right? Williams says, look, that might avoid the boredom issue, but now you run into the identity issue, right? It's not really you in those various lives. It's just so many different various lives being lived by effectively different individuals. The disjointed lives one is a situation where we can meet the memory or the identity condition. So Williams says, okay, I realize that with the second one, with the sort of reincarnation idea of the serial lives, we're failing the identity condition. But of course, what it is that makes somebody the same person through time can be fairly contested. So let's just assume that we somehow set up the identity conditions for what it is to be the same person through time in such a way that somebody can be the same person, although they have disjointed states of consciousness. Right? So when I was saying, say what really makes me me is my spirit, or whatever we want to call it, which itself has lived through numerous other lives, but I have no conscious, memory. There's no continuity of consciousness between those previous lives and my current life as Carl Ladrud. So Williams is basically saying, look, for the sake of argument, let's just assume we can come up with certain identity conditions which make you the same person through time, but have disjointed states of consciousness. So one way to do this and make it pretty sensible, I think, would be just take who I am now, Carl Ladrud, and let's assume at some point during the course of my bodily life, I suffer some kind of brain injury or fill in the details however you want, but I lose all of my memories, I lose my categorical desires and so on, I become somebody else. So let's say I take on a different name. I also have different categorical desires. Rather than wanting to be a philosopher and whatever else it is that I live for, right? I come to have very different sorts of desires during this particular bodily life I'm experiencing, right? So think about wanting to paint snails and, steal candy from children as reasons to live, right? Imagine that's what I'm like in 5 years, right? And I don't remember being Carl Ladrud. I go by a different name. I don't have the same kinds of memories. I don't have the same sorts of behaviors and so on, right? So you got one bodily life carrying on. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we identify who I am with the existence of my body, rather than my consciousness, my memories, my personal characteristics, desires, and so on. Williams says, okay, if that's the situation, right, for the sake of argument, then we've met the identity condition, because for the sake of argument, we're just saying that we're meeting the identity condition somehow or rather in a way that allows for disjointed states of consciousness. You could also think of like a Dr. Jekyll, or no, Mr. Jekyll, yeah, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of situation, or anything else like that that involves some sort of issue of split consciousness, something like this. So sure, we can meet the identity condition this way, but ultimately, Williams thinks we're still going to fail the desirability condition, right? We're not going to want that. That's just not the kind of thing that our current categorical desires would allow for. And one other thing to note there, he is also really allowing here for, in some sense, some kind of, perhaps not reincarnation under this, the Disjointed Lives version, but just sort of different lives occurring with some kind of continuity that we can trace through them. Okay, lastly, the Tiresias model. So this one, to really understand this one, it's useful to know a little bit of mythology. So Tiresias, sort of Greek mythological character, who really lives through a whole series of different lives. But then all of those lives culminate in a single person's memory. So this would be really having all kinds of separate lives, which themselves are separated off, right? So there's Karl Laderud and there's each of you. But in the Tiresias model, Tiresias, in some sense, takes on someone else. So while, I could be Tiresias, or really Tiresias is me, lives my life, and then once my life is done, reverts back to Tiresias, takes on some other life, lives that life with no memory of being Karl and so on. But ultimately, through living all those lives, there's still a point at which Tiresias is Tiresias, but Tiresias is really the culmination of all of these individuals and their ideas and all of these things together. Now, Williams says this one just really doesn't make for a person. As he puts it, Tiresias is not eventually a person, but a phenomenon. Tiresias is really a kind of thing, an occurrence, but not a person, right? Because really what it is this sort of imagination of trying to mash together all sorts of different people into one person. But ultimately, Williams says that doesn't really make sense, right? You don't really get a person out of that. You get sort of a mash together of different things. Okay, so these are really the four models of immortality that Williams thinks are, in some sense, plausible. We can think about them. And he says, ultimately, none of these really meet the conditions for a meaningful and a desirable immortal human life, right? So really, to get that, what you would have to have is a life that makes boredom unthinkable. So really, Williams thinks because boredom is this perpetual possibility that we can run out of our categorical desires at some point. What we really need is something, right? Some kind of life that would make boredom just utterly unthinkable. Because as long as it's thinkable, as long as it's possible, eventually it's going to strike us. Eventually we're going to get sick and tired of engaging the sorts of projects and activities that we do, right? We're going to come to see them as purposeless or not worth doing, or, right? You can probably re-describe it some other ways. And really, Williams thinks this goes for any kind of immortal life, whether it's here on Earth or up in heaven or wherever it might be. It has to be something that just excludes the possibility of boredom, right? So any kind of normal activity, he thinks, really isn't going to meet this condition, precisely because our relationship to our environment is going to change if we become immortal. Right, our concept of time, our concept of the world around us, how we feel connected or not connected to those things, is going to take on a very different character, and we're just not going to have the same kind of experiences we did. Right? So if we want a kind of existence, a kind of immortal life, where boredom is just impossible, is either normal activities, right, but an impoverishment of our consciousness, sort of reducing our conscious awareness of ourselves, that eliminates the boredom we would experience in them. So really, in a sense, making ourselves less aware of our own condition. And here again, we think about Nagel, going to the contented infant, or in some sense, making us not fully human anymore. Right? You think of an animal who's engaged in some sort of normal activity, sunning themselves, or I don't know, chasing bugs through the grass or something. Right? You think of like cats and dogs here. Maybe they could be happy doing that forever, precisely because they don't have the kind of consciousness we have that would allow them to recognize what they're doing and get bored with it. Right? So one option is that we lose that kind of conscious awareness. We become sort of less, sorry for the repetition, but less aware of what it is we're doing and less susceptible to boredom. That would be one way out of it, right? We just keep doing whatever it is we do, and we just sort of turn off that part of our minds that allows us to recognize that, hey, I've been doing this for 1,000,000 years now. I don't know if it's really worth doing anymore. So that'd be one way to go about it, which Williams himself doesn't think is really a good one. The other way is to be totally absorbed in what we're doing all the time. And now, really, this is my way of putting it here, but I really think this is what Williams is getting at. If we sort of make our consciousness less sophisticated, so we lose the ability to get bored with normal activities, ultimately, I think that's going to be equivalent to the situation where we're totally absorbed in what we're doing all the time. Maybe they are a little bit different, but I think they boil down to basically the same thing. So this possibility of being constantly engaged in activities that are totally absorbing, being engaged in something that we are just unable to find boring, right? Being bored impossible, as Williams demands. Now, Williams rejects this too, right? Why? It seems like we finally struck on the thing that would make an immortal life desirable, wouldn't it? Right? We're constantly absorbed in what we're doing. We don't have time to think about how long we've been doing it, or get bored, or realize how repetitive and monotonous it is. Wouldn't that be the best thing? Williams doesn't think so. Why? Well, if we're totally absorbed in what we're doing, right? If we're constantly, forever, eternally engaged in this kind of project, in some sense, this phrase, this terminology of losing ourselves comes in, right? When you're totally absorbed in what you're doing, you lose yourself in it. That is, you lose your conscious awareness of really who you are. So it seems like what happens is that we actually fail to meet the identity condition. Remember when Williams laid out those two conditions, he says, look, it really needs to be me who lives forever, and my desires in the future have to be suitably related, right? I think maybe the language was slightly different, to my desires now. My categorical desires need to carry on in a fairly static manner from now into the future. So he says, look, if you're constantly absorbed in what you're doing, you don't really have any time to think about who you are and have that kind of conscious awareness of the fact that you are you and that you exist and that you're engaged in these sorts of projects. So it seems like in some sense you can really lose who you are. And near the end, when he's talking about Spinoza and sort of the life of contemplation and so on, this is really what he's talking about. You imagine a kind of afterlife where you lose your sense of distinctness and who you are, right? You just sort of get absorbed into the great infinite of whatever the afterlife is, right? Or maybe you continue being you, but you're so constantly absorbed in doing philosophy or some kind of mental activity, or it could be any kind of activity, but one that occupies your conscious attention, that you never recognize who you are. You never sort of step back and say, oh yeah, I'm me, and here I am living forever doing these sorts of things. So it seems like at least the first condition of a desirable immortality isn't met, right? If we're always completely absorbed in what we're doing. The second condition might not be as well, depending on what sorts of categorical desires we now have, right? If our current categorical desires are just to say, right, just do something like philosophy forever, which Williams himself points to and says, many people have found doing philosophy or other sorts of intellectual activity to in fact be a categorical desire. It's very desirable in certain senses. It's something you can do for a very long time, seems rewarding in itself, something you get lost in, right? But depending on what sorts of categorical desires you have, doing something like that forever might in fact not meet your current categorical desires either, because maybe you've got multiple categorical desires and being perpetually lost in one thing just isn't the sort of existence you really want. So ultimately in the end, Williams concludes that no immortal life can meet both of these conditions, the identity condition and the desirability condition, right? No immortal life that seems suitably human can make it so that it's us that lasts forever and avoids boredom, avoids exhausting our categorical desires without just introducing new ones that in fact wouldn't be suitably related to our current ones. So really, when it gets right down to it at the end, Williams thinks really living forever, having an immortal existence, just is not ultimately a good thing, right? For life to be meaningful, it has to end in death, right, at some point. To be immortal forever, in fact, would be antithetical to leading a meaningful existence. But Williams also wants to hold that death can still be a bad thing, precisely because if our lives are cut short, right, before we've lived long enough to fulfill our categorical desires, at least enough, right, until we effectively get bored of them, death can still be a bad thing, precisely because it cuts off our ability to experience these things. So the very last paragraph, I'm just going to read the very last paragraph of it because I think it sort of sums up nicely what Williams wants to conclude. He says, suppose then that categorical desire does sustain the desire to live. So long as it remains so, I shall want not to die. Yet I also know, if what has gone before is right, that an eternal life would be unlivable. In part, as E.M.'s case originally suggested, that is because categorical desire will go away from it. In those versions, such as hers, in which I am recognizably myself, I would eventually have had altogether too much of myself. There are good reasons, surely, for dying before that happens. But equally, at times earlier than that moment, there is reason for not dying. Necessarily, it tends to be either too early or too late. E.M. reminds us that it can be too late, and many, as against Lucretius, need no reminding that it can be too early. If that is any sort of dilemma, it can, as things still are, and if one is exceptionally lucky, be resolved, not by doing anything, but just by dying shortly before the horrors of not doing so become evident. Technological progress may, in more than one direction, make that piece of luck rarer, by making us live longer and live past what would be our most desirable time to die, effectively. That's what Williams is saying. But, as things are, he continues, it is possible to be, in contrast to E.M., felix opportunitate mortis, as it can be appropriately mistranslated, lucky in having the chance to die. So, thinking back to Nagel, who ends his piece really saying, is it always the case that living longer would be good? Right? Would immortality really be a good thing? Is death always an evil, given that we can see it as an evil, at least in some sense? Williams answers quite clearly, no, death isn't always an evil. In fact, at some point, it becomes a good. At some point, it becomes quite welcome. Because if you go on living forever, you're going to really become sick of yourself. You're going to become sick of life, right? If you go on living as you, at some point, it's not going to be desirable to continue on that way anymore. Not because of certain, I'll frame it as external circumstances, like a deteriorating body or mind or being in perpetual suffering or something like that, but rather just because your reasons for live will eventually exhaust themselves, right? And so to go on living would just be sort of insufferably boring, right? You just have no reason to go on. You wouldn't have the right kind of connection to the world around you. Now, dying too early can certainly be bad as well, and Williams admits this, precisely because we want to go on. We've got these categorical desires that give us a reason to live, and we are frustrated and upset and angry when we can't fulfill those sorts of desires. So the categorical desires are desires we have that can stretch beyond our own lives. They themselves give us a reason for living. But given too much time, eventually we'll exhaust or lose those categorical desires, and hence our lives will cease to be worth living. So ultimately, a meaningful life has to be one that ends. Has to be one that ends in the kind of death Nagel was talking about, some sort of infinite death, right? Just the cessation of existence entirely. The only alternative, Williams says, would be somehow to be, eliminate the possibility of boredom, right? Just eliminate that from our existence. But that would involve changing us and what we're like so much that we would still fail one of those two conditions. We wouldn't really be who we were anymore. Or, if we were somehow still us, we would have changed the what we're doing and what we're able to do in such a way that it really doesn't connect to our categorical desires in the right way. So that now our judgment about whether or not it would be worth living in that condition in the future, we would ultimately have to conclude, no, it really wouldn't be worth living like that at all. All right, so that takes me to the end of my remarks on Williams. Hopefully that helps clear things up a little bit and gives you a better idea of what he's going after, because there's a lot in that piece. There's still quite a bit I haven't even touched on and tried to clear up here. By all means, if there's parts of it you're interested in and want to hear more about, feel free to try to look it up on the internet or shoot me an email or come chat to me during the office hours or something. I'm happy to give you some more information about it. But I think that should be enough information to really get you a fairly clear picture of the essential points in the arguments he's making about the relationship between immortality and meaningful life. Now, in tomorrow's video, I'm going to be taking a look at John Martin Fisher's piece on immortality. And if you think Williams made some missteps and that some of his claims really weren't justified here, Fisher is going to offer criticism of Williams' view and propose an alternative view. So just stay tuned for that. Until tomorrow, I hope you're doing well. Bye for now.